23-year-old Fernando Parado was in a coma due to a head injury. The plane had crashed at approximately 3:34 p.m., and an hour later, the Chilean Air Search and Rescue Agency set out to search for Flight 571. However, due to the evening time, darkness, snow, and strong winds, the rescue team had to return. Meanwhile, 33 people, injured and in critical condition, were lying in one corner of the broken plane. Everyone believed that news of the plane crash had reached the rescue team and that it was only a matter of surviving the night. Those who had sustained minor injuries decided to cover the open section of the plane to create some space. They somehow covered the open section of the plane using broken seats and suitcases and spent the freezing night shivering. However, 5 people could not survive the icy night, leaving a total of 28 survivors. As the morning of October 14th dawned, everyone hoped that the rescue team would find them that day. 11 rescue planes from Chile and Uruguay set out in search of Flight 571. The search area they had chosen was correct, but due to the plane's white color, the rescue team could not locate them that day. The crash survivors saw 3 rescue planes fly overhead that day. They tried to write SOS on the plane's roof using lipstick, but the lipstick ran out after writing just the S. Later, they used suitcases to create a large cross on the snow, hoping to be noticed. But all these efforts went in vain. After continuing the rescue operation for 8 days, on October 21st, the rescue team decided there was no point in continuing. They believed it was unlikely anyone could have survived for so many days. Meanwhile, the injured passengers had only a small amount of food: 8 chocolate bars, 3 small jars of jam, 1 tin of mussels, a box of almonds, some dates, candies, dried plums, and a few bottles of wine. Barely enough for 29 people. Fernando Parado survived on a single chocolate-covered peanut for 3 days. Parado had woken up from a coma 3 days after the crash, only to find out that his mother had died in the accident and his sister was critically injured. He tried his best to keep her alive, but she succumbed to her injuries on the 8th day after the crash. For drinking water, Vito Strauch devised a method by using a metal seat to focus the sun's rays on a specific spot to melt snow into water. The melted water was then collected in empty wine bottles. Similarly, some survivors used the wool from the seats to protect themselves from the freezing cold. The sunlight was reflecting off the snow, causing severe damage to the eyes of the injured survivor. They had only 3 pairs of sunglasses among them. Meanwhile, they discovered a one-way communication radio in the wreckage of the plane, which allowed them to listen to news from the outside world. One of the players, Marcelo, who had technical knowledge, managed to repair the radio. On the 11th day after the crash, they heard the heartbreaking news that the search operation had been called off. Upon hearing this, some players broke down in tears, while others began praying. However, Fernando Parado and a few others refused to give up hope. They started planning how to survive, knowing they needed to find a way to procure food. But at an altitude of 3,800 meters, there were no trees or animals, and their remaining food supplies were depleted. Now, they faced the ultimate question of life and death. To stay alive, they had to make tough and seemingly impossible decisions. Some survivors tried to eat the cotton and leather from the plane seats, but this worsened their condition, making them even sicker. The situation became so dire that some were forced to make an unthinkable decision. They resolved to survive by consuming the flesh of their deceased friends and family members. The idea was proposed by Roberto Canessa, who was the first to act on it. Initially, many survivors refused to accept this idea and declined to eat the human flesh. However, 2 days later, when hunger and weakness became unbearable, they too reluctantly turned to the same option. This decision was emotionally devastating and immensely difficult, but they had no other means to stay alive. In this ordeal, survivors who initially weighed around 80 kilograms were reduced to just 35 to 40 kilograms. They had grown so weak that they lacked the strength to take any significant action, and their food source was rapidly depleting. Meanwhile, on the 16th night after the crash, a terrifying event unfolded. An avalanche roared down from the mountain peak and filled the wreckage of the plane with snow. This catastrophe suffocated 8 people to death under the weight of the snow. Fernando Parado, showing immense courage, used a metal rod to dig his way out from beneath the snow. When he reached the surface, he was met with a fierce snowstorm and violent winds. Realizing the danger outside, he decided it was safer to remain inside the wreckage. Parado and the remaining survivors huddled together in the cramped confines of the plane, enduring the storm for 3 grueling days. When the storm finally subsided, they emerged to face a grim realization. Waiting for rescue was futile. If they wanted to survive, they had to find a way out on their own. Canessa, Parado, and Vizintin were the strongest mentally and physically physically among the survivors. Hence, the group collectively decided that these three would attempt to leave the crash site and find help. However, the biggest challenge was that they had no idea where they were. They recalled the pilot's last word that the plane had crossed Curacao, and based on this, they estimated that walking a few kilometers westward might lead them to a town or settlement. Due to bad weather, they waited for a few days before setting out. On November 15th, 33 days after the crash, the three men began their journey to seek help. The survivors gave them the warmest clothes and the maximum food they could spare to ensure their survival for as many days as possible. A few hours into their trek, they stumbled upon the plane's tail section, which had broken off during the crash and landed on a slope. Inside, they found additional supply, including tins of chocolate, some food, and the plane's two-way communication system. They also discovered a battery nearby. This find prompted them to halt their journey temporarily and return to the crash site to attempt to repair the radio. The following day, they brought Roy Harley, who had some knowledge of electronics, to the tail section. The group hoped that Roy could repair and activate the radio. However, their efforts proved unsuccessful as the radio required 115 volts AC to function, whereas the battery only provided 24 volts DC. This faint glimmer of hope faded, and several days passed with no progress in their attempt to establish contact. December 11th, 59 days after the plane crash, another devastating avalanche struck, claiming 3 more lives. Now, only 16 survivors remain. The following day, December 12th, after the storm subsided, Parado, Canessa, and Vizintin set out once again to cross the mountains in search of help. Believing they only needed to climb a few kilometers, they carried food for 3 days. However, as soon as they began the climb, they found themselves slipping back down after gaining a little height. They had no climbing equipment, so they had to rely on their hands and feet to ascend. This grueling effort took 3 days. By the 4th day, they realized they didn't have enough food to continue. They decided that Vizintin should return to the crash site to ensure that Parado and Canessa could proceed further. Using a metal plate as a sled, Vizintin slid down the mountain and reached the crash site within an hour, while Parado and Canessa pressed on with their climb. As they ascended, the thinning air made breathing increasingly difficult, but with sheer determination and willpower, they finally reached the mountain's summit. What they saw from the top, however, shattered their spirit. Instead of a lush valley, they saw an endless expanse of towering mountains stretching as far as the eye could see.